into number lucky 13 for our Patreon question and inquiry, and who knows what we call my responses. Thanks to everybody in the Patreon for continuing to support the whole madness. Zorba the Greek called the wife, the house, the children, the whole catastrophe. So thank you for helping with the whole catastrophe of Adept Play. And this little part of it, well, it's going to take the big coffee for this set of questions. See? JC has questions about a fairly broad set, I would say 20 years of a rather weird trajectory of role-playing design and publishing. Oh man, it's a little scattered. I'll try to condense. Intra-conflict consequences during extended contests in Hero Wars, Hero Quest, and Quest Worlds from unrelated actions. That's the really specific question. Then there's, as you can imagine, kind of a bigger box to discuss. Let's go over that again. Let's context. 2000, the publication of Hero Wars, published by Greg's company at the time, Isaris Inc. So then, upon all sorts of impossible to summarize without a whiteboard shenanigans, the next version of the game was published as Hero Quest. On my screen, I also have popped up the quick start guide rules summary that goes with this, which is a bit edited from that version, from the print version. And I also have up there the Hero Quest from 2013 in PDF. I have the Quest Worlds SRD, at least at the last phase that I saw it. And I've given a little thought to, this question, looking through those. There may be one or another version. I don't think so. I think there may be another Hero Quest that came out after that book copy, but I don't have it, if there is. So I've looked through them, and in order to compare those versions, we quickly, I think, I hate it when people say that, like the movie reviewer says, and then we see. It's like, I wasn't there, asshole. Well, anyway, should we all be seated in a discourse together, I would not accept the idea that we are looking at a single system, that we are looking at a role-playing game that happens to have undergone a few edits and tweaks and stuff like that in a sequential fashion. We are looking at different games. This is much like I talk about with the line of Dungeons & Dragons written by Holmes and then Moldvay and then Menser. And Cook scattered in there too. To discuss this big box, I'll be very blunt. I think that the design of the game as a playable entity decreased during that whole sector, so that when I look at Quest Worlds, the SRD right now, I don't want to play it. I don't think it's a good game. So which one are we talking about? What's relevant? What aspects of it are relevant to the point I'm going to make? I'll be very quick about what I think the big distinction is, which is that this game is, despite all rhetoric to the contrary, visceral, detailed, explicit, hard-hitting, consequential, and non-negotiable in its moment-to-moment combat actions. This goes against everything we're supposed to think about this. This is a story game. It's a narrativist. It's narrative. It's all these words that people throw around and have no idea what they're saying. It's abstract. That's not an abstract system. I mean, the edge of that axe crunches into your shoulder. I mean, it's pretty straightforward in this regard. So Anybody doesn't believe me, we'll play it sometime and you'll feel the axe. All the things about, I throw my axe, to that guy so he can bring it in on the troll, after he's been, knocked to the ground and his stuff is all over the place. And, I'll throw it to him and he realizes he's holding my axe so he can fight the troll all of a sudden again. All that stuff is in there and it's not word brush. What's going on with the question specifically again? The question specifically is, we are dealing with something called an extended context, which is what I've been talking about this whole time. We're talking about a detailed conflict in which we really don't know how long it's going to go, and we don't know how it's going to turn out, and has many different little sub pieces as we go along with different nuances. A combat system. Shock. So in it, you have consequences of each round. So, for example, somebody could have all of their rolls knocked down by a certain amount. You have a blanket penalty now. Sometimes knocked down by 50%. You can have these. What really happens are these ebbs and flows of things called in the original action points, and they very much represent. You blow some action points in order to throw that guy your axe, as well as losing them and gaining them through the outcomes of the rolls. They are very slightly adjustable by hero points, which are a very scarce resource. So tend to have a lot of weight, but not to override the dice in the long run. So we have some pretty important, changes in values and scores. And one thing you take is wounds. With all that stated, and getting away from the idea that we're dealing with just, roll and then these things go up and down, and we'll roll and these things go up and down. And when you run out of points, then you lose. And we just get to describe whatever as we go along is not the description of the system. You are getting numerically hammered and suddenly advantaged or whatever. And you can't get those effects unless you talk about what you're doing. So we know what it represents. It is a deeply representative system. You merely have to do your job in the right place, which is not after the roll. So with all that stated, there is something that is called an unrelated action. And I went through all the versions that I've got, which is, if not all of them, and most of them, pretty sure it's all. And the text has been sort of just traveled, through the editions. Unrelated actions is when it's your go and you're going to do something that actually isn't involved in the current extended contest. It's obviously in the purview of your activity, but it cannot properly be said to be, killing that dude. It's opening that door. So you go and you open that door. Now, at that point, depending on what the activity is that you're up to as an unrelated action, you may have to do a sudden simple contest. And a simple contest is a one roll. So you could call it a skill check if you want to, in the context of this unrelated action, because it is a brief moment. And that's all an unrelated action is, and it has no other meaning. It can't do anything toward the extended contest. It literally cannot do anything toward the extended contest. If it does, then it's an action in there, and that's your go, and it will have action point consequences and be all related to that. And there are built-in things such as, destroying doing enough action point change so that the person's capacity to do a certain thing is gone. You can do all that sort of stuff, but it's in the action point matrix of activity and consequences. Doing an unrelated action has to be unrelated. So JC's point was, what if a character... Okay, here we go. Unrelated actions seem to be loosely defined on how those outcomes affect extended contests. If you're in a duel, you could not use an unrelated action to wound your opponent, but you could use disarm them. That's actually not anywhere in the text. So I checked with JC on this, and so as not to, have this maybe striking back at him for asking this, it led us to review the texts, and he realized that he had actually ported that over from other games. So to some extent, this question is based basically on just kind of the stew of different things and saying, well, this game's like that game, and in this game you can do this, so in that game you could do that. In the course of that logic chain, going and looking at the simple contests, well, a lot of the time you can run a simple contest to do things like resolving a fight and doing things like wounding an opponent or disarming them or something like that as a simple contest. So JC saw that and says, oh, well, if you can do a simple contest in the middle of an extended contest, then why don't you just port all of that, all the things you can do with a simple contest over? No, I think that's a category error. I think we're starting from in the context of extended contests. We are necessarily saying if it's an unrelated action, it's an unrelated action. And then and only then do we go and say, okay, can that action, necessarily unrelated, be talked about in terms of a simple contest? You can't suddenly port in all the potential of all simple contests operating on their own without an extended contest around into an extended contest. I think that the hard line between related and unrelated for all the rest of JC's questions is pretty much solves the issue. No, you can't do an unrelated action to, cut off this brew lord's, squad of supporters, from him, doing that as an unrelated action. And so then all of a sudden he doesn't have that ability to use in the extended contest. This is basically trying to beat the system. The system's already in place. If you want to get rid of that brew horde, then you have to go after that brew horde. And there are very clear rules about how followers and other members of an extended contest get knocked out. So all those mechanisms are in there. And as I say, they are quite direct, quite visceral, quite causal, and quite quantitative. So there we go. I hope this was positive enough. It is very overwhelming to try to cope with that trajectory of game design, and especially if you're trying to kind of mine across the editions to try and get what it is when there isn't an it. They are different games. And it's very difficult to do that, of course, when you have other games all swimming around in your head too, like we all do. So totally understand that. Well, here we go. This is another question that is perhaps more about the question than about the answer. Pablo asks, did you really conceive Sorcerer as a humorous game in the vein of Christopher Moore? This is a reference to something I said at the Discord. In the references for Sorcerer, there is the book Practical Demon Keeping by Christopher Moore. And it is also mentioned by me in passing every so often, always positively and always in the context of, and yes, that's a Sorcerer, book, in the sense that I was reading it and it was on my mind and I was excited by it. And it plays directly into the design of the game, just as much as, for example, Elric of Melniboné. Well, however, my answer to the question is no, because the question is phrased in a way that is not the same as what I just said. First of all, in the vein of Christopher Moore might refer to his whole body of work, like, the one about the lust lizard and all these things. His stories, or these novels, are set in a fictional town just south of where I grew up. And the local cultural, well, what reads like satire, but is kind of local cultural reportage, is accurate. So a native of that area, reads this and is like, that guy's onto us, or I know that place, or I know that guy, and stuff like that. So, in the first book, Practical Demon Keeping, the one I reference, there are many funny moments, but it is effectively a dark-ish story, and a little bit sad, a little bit grim, a little bit aware of the human cost of life, not just finding demons, but of life and the things that people have been led to, or the things that people have gone through. Even a character who, if you read an excerpt or two, looks like sort of a comedic, a comedic figure of fun, the witch character who, tries to bind Catch at one point. I quote it in the book, right? She's trying to impress the demon, with having, summoned him up, and the demon is unimpressed. Well, anyway, it seems humorous, but if you read the whole book and you read her backstory that's embedded in there, it's much sadder and true to life and darker and more sympathetic for every character, even some of the more spectacular, awful ones, that you can... It's not just making fun of people and seeing them, die off or come to grim fates or come to happy fates or whatever for fun. The other books are like that. The Lust Lizard of Melancholy Cove is very much like that. They're all set in the same place, and they get more and more and more, what's the word? Because it was funny the first time, then we're going to do more comedy the next time. So, the characters become very Flanderized versions of themselves, the continuing ones, and it is... I actually kind of gave up after a bit. I bought several of the books, and I don't know if he's still pumping them out, but by even the second one after Practical Demon Keeping, the drop and the comedy for, it's funny haha sake is primary. So a humorous game in the vein of Christopher Moore. No, not in the vein of Christopher Moore as an ongoing author, as influenced heavily by his first, and I think rather heartfelt book, Practical Demon Keeping. So that, I hope, is the answer. There is an element of it that I find very 90s. I relate it as well to the better portions of the comic Hellblazer, and a number of other influences. One could even point to Dario Argento, the filmmaker, in which there is a sort of dark, wicked, unexpected, in some cases, humor, where at least I, as a practitioner, find that you don't see it coming yourself. All of a sudden this is happening and that's happening, and then, oh my God, just right here, you suddenly think, and I think that's funny. Oh no. And so that is the quality that I very much think is intrinsic, really baked into that novel, and that I found very compelling, and as part of my big influences in working on the game.